Normally, I only cover games I'm actually already familiar with on this channel, but I was recently sent a game called Granvir, a self-described mech building roguelike that looked pretty interesting, and so I figured I'd set aside an afternoon or two to get some runs in and give my first impressions on a game that I'm starting to think has a lot of potential. Since Granvir is first and foremost a roguelike, its approach to mech combat is massively simplified compared to something like MechWarrior, but it's managed to retain a lot of what makes those titles fun, keeping combat satisfying, snappy, and most importantly, modular. The pool of weapons and components is fairly impressive, leaving you plenty of room to design a new mech from the ground up every run, with a wide variety of playstyles and customization not only available from run to run, but from mission to mission. The game is constantly giving you opportunities to seek out upgrades for your mech, but these upgrades often require you to seek out optional fights as you explore each level, forcing the player to sacrifice some safety if they want additional chances at run-changing items. In between missions, the player is given opportunities to customize and repair their mech, as well as shop for new upgrades and other services that can aid you on your run. Many of these actions use credits that you earn from completing objectives during each mission, but they also take time to complete, with the player only having a set amount of hours to prepare for the next battle. Ideally, this creates a system where a player needs to strategically manage their resources, making difficult decisions not only during the missions but between them in order to get the best chances at a successful run. In practice, managing your resources seems to boil down to repairing your mech and then checking if you can afford anything cool in the shop before you move on to your next mission. While the combat of your average roguelike is ultimately the bread and butter that each game lives and dies on, providing the players with meaningful decisions between missions is what keeps players coming back. And I think this segment of the game would benefit massively from two changes. The first is the inclusion of more text-based narrative choices like you see in a game like Faster Than Light. An experienced mechanic offers to help you. Do you choose a free weapon upgrade or a free mech repair? Or a group of refugees fleeing the battlefield? Do you give them some of your hard-earned supplies or send them on their way? Or perhaps a nearby stockpile reportedly has a cutting-edge weapon that could change your run completely, but taking the extra time to find it would alert the enemy, adding an elite mech to the opposing forces during your next battle. These sort of simple narrative elements serve not only to diversify the player's experience from run to run, but also help the game come alive a bit, adding some narrative elements to a game that is currently extremely light on world building. The second change is a bit less exciting, but arguably a lot more important. Granvir needs a UI overhaul, perhaps more than it needs anything else. I'm sure, as an inexperienced player, I'm missing some options between missions, in part because the UI just isn't great at prioritizing which information gets communicated to the player most urgently, instead putting pretty much every game function in a big long list of buttons. On top of that, this button here does the same thing as this button. Repairing your mech requires you to press here and here on each individual part, with no option to just repair your entire mech all at once, and part tooltips use the same font for everything, making it difficult to locate important stats at a glance, or in the case of some part upgrades, not showing vital information at all. Some resorting of vital information, as well as quality of life changes to cut down on the number of repetitive inputs, would work wonders for Granvir, making it look significantly more professional, as well as helping newer players understand what their options are. But of course, Granvir is still in development, and it's not at all uncommon for UI tweaks to fall to the bottom of the priority list, often not getting done until the last minute. So this is hardly an indictment on the game's potential. The focus has clearly been put on the mechs and the wide variety of components and weapons the game makes available to you, and that's something that I have a hard time blaming anyone for. I'm impressed with the way that Granvir incorporates familiar mech concepts like component radiant damage and heat management in a streamlined way that doesn't bog down the pace of each run, keeping the game fast and approachable like a roguelike should be, without sacrificing too much of the mech genre's mechanical quirks. The game also does a good job representing both sides of the mech genre, with some truly out there weapon designs and flashy movement abilities that were clearly inspired by classic mecha properties, as well as some more grounded, heavily armored choices for people that just want to play as a lumbering fortress. Granvir also does a pretty decent job of representing some of these build options in the form of enemy mechs, but there's definitely some room for improvement there. I'd personally like to see more elite enemies as the game progresses, perhaps boss fights and enemies with bigger health bars, opposed to just greater numbers of enemies, and in the current version of the game, I actually think that non-mech enemy types are slightly overrepresented, and are occasionally a bit of a pain to fight, especially if you're using a melee weapon that can't efficiently target things on the ground. Speaking of the ground, the game's environments also leave some room for improvement. The low-res blocky style is absolutely something that you can lean into, and the mechs all looking pretty good is proof of that, but the environments themselves reuse assets a little too often, giving levels a uniform look that makes level design feel like a bit of an afterthought. Of course, the game obviously would benefit from bundles and bundles of new assets, but at the end of the day, Granvir is a low-budget Unity game, and I think it would still benefit quite a bit from some more strategic changes, like varying tree sizes a bit and making better use of some small elevation changes to make levels feel less like a flat box. But even as it is now, Granvir is worth checking out. Airborne Games have managed to bring something new to the table, and though their project certainly needs a lot of polish, this unique iteration of mech combat is something that I look forward to keeping an eye on as development continues.